afternoon. On behalf of Notre Dame's Alumni Association, I'd like to welcome you to today's On the Sidelines presentation. My name is Mandy Kanukin, and I serve as the Academic Program Director for the Alumni Association, and I'm delighted to share this program with you. In its 5th year, the On the Sidelines lecture series is one example of the Alumni Association's academic programs that are designed to foster the spirit of lifelong learning for our alumni and our friends. Through our academic programs, our aim is to put a spotlight on the amazing work the Notre Dame faculty do here on campus and throughout the world, and to share this work with our alumni and friends. Today's lecture is about a certain football game that took place about 50 years ago. Perhaps you've heard about it. Our speakers today, John Heisler and Clark Power, will take us back to 1966, when in the midst of the game of the century, there were social, political, and cultural events that were causing change all over the country. Today, we will explore how these controversies can eventually lead to ethical insight and perhaps mutual understanding. We have a lot to pack into a short hour, so I'm going to keep my introductions short, even though they could be quite long. First, allow me to introduce our first speaker, John Heisler. John has been a member of the university's Notre Dame's athletic staff for 39 years, and currently serves as Senior Associate Athletics Director. As part of his many responsibilities with the athletics department, including media relations and working with the football and basketball programs, John has edited Irish football highlight films and has even done color analysis of Notre Dame basketball games on radio and TV. John has written, co-written, or edited 10 books on Notre Dame football, including helping former Irish coach Lou Holtz in The Fighting Spirit, the best-selling story of Notre Dame's '88 national championship football season. To say he's an expert on the topic of Notre Dame football would be an understatement. I'd also like to introduce our other speaker, Professor Clark Power. Dr. Power is a professor of psychology and education in the College of Arts and Letters Program of Liberal Studies at Notre Dame. During his more than 30 years of teaching, Professor Clark has authored 6 books and more than 70 articles as one of the nation's leading minds in moral education and developmental psychology. In 2006, his research and experiences led him to develop and direct the Play Like a Champion Today program, which is designed to assist youth and high school coaches, administrators, and parents in nurturing character development through sports. The program has served over 84,000 coaches and parents through a network of 160 trained trainers in over 50 cities throughout the United States. And it's directly based on Dr. Power's research that rethinks the role that youth sports play in child development, making it less about winning, self-promotion, and profits, and more about morals, character, and civic education. Now, before John Heisler takes the stage, I'm going to play a video about 5 minutes long from the year 1966. The video is taken from the archives and is basically a highlight reel from the game of the century, Notre Dame versus Michigan State in 1966. Enjoy.
Notre Dame, Michigan State, the most anticipated, publicized, and discussed collegiate football game of the decade has finally arrived. W. Dougherty's undefeated and number 2 ranked Spartans last head on with Arapasigian's undefeated and number 1 ranked Fighting Irish for the National Collegiate Championship. In the first quarter, Irish quarterback Terry Hanratty rolls away from the odd-rushing Spartans and completes a peg to Bob Gladio. But now fate plays a trick on Hanratty and Notre Dame. As the Irish passer turns the corner, big number 95, Thomas Smith, slams him down, causing a shoulder separation and forcing Coach Parsegian to go with OBrien at quarterback. After holding the Irish attack, Jimmy Ray and the Spartans take charge. Ray hits State's all-time top pass receiver, Gene Washington, on a 42-yard completion as the first period comes to play. Ray calls on Regis Cavender, filling in for the injured Bob Apisa. Cavender plows through for 11 more yards. 3 plays later, our slow motion camera rolls as a sophomore fullback is asked to get the final yards. Regis Cavender falls into the end zone for the game's first touchdown. It's only the second time all season that Notre Dame has trailed an opponent. The Spartans move on top 7-0. The battle of the undefeated Giants continues later in the second quarter. Jimmy Ray, unable to find a receiver open, turns on his tremendous speed. The junior scrambler gathers blockers and nets the formidable Irish defense for 30 yards. The Spartans are second in the nation in rushing, and show why as their offensive line provides plenty of running room for Dwight Lee. Mixing his plays well, Ray elects to throw the ball. But All-American candidate Jim Lynch intercepts. A ferocious tackle by Cliff Jones causes the Notre Dame captain to fumble, and Michigan State recovers. It's a big break for the Spartans. The Big Ten champions are most noted for their ground attack, but Jimmy Ray is a constant aerial threat, having completed better than 50% of his passes this year. He adds another 17-yarder to Gene Washington. But collegiate football's third-best defensive unit halts the drive, forcing a field goal attempt. Dick Kenny's 47-yard boot is good, and Michigan State jumps out to a 10-0 lead, much to the dismay of Ara Pasekian. OBrien is more of a roll-out passer than Hanratty. Bob Gladio is open in this 11-yard toss, and the Irish are fighting back. Notre Dame has averaged 37 points per game this year and is not going to be kept down for long. O'Brien connects with Rocky Blair to move 9 yards closer to Painter. On a 2nd-down-1 situation, the 19-year-old quarterback rifles a touchdown pass to Gladio, and Notre Dame finally lights up the scoreboard. The top-scoring team in the country gets close 10-7. Let's take a closer look with our isolated camera. Bob Gladio charges past Jess Phillips to make the catch. It's Coley O'Brien's first TV pass of the year and pulls Notre Dame to within 3 points at halftime. Near the end of the third quarter, Notre Dame is back on the march. Coley O'Brien passes complete to Rocky Blair for 9 yards. The Irish, finding it hard to crack the state forward wall, stays in the air. Larry Tranjar grabs this O'Brien pass for 18 more yards. From midfield, the McLean, Virginia youngster looks to pass again. He spots Dave Haley on the sideline 23 yards away. Haley makes the catch, and the Irish are getting close. A few plays later, Notre Dame faces a critical 3rd-down play. O'Brien wants to pass for the all-important 1st down, but he's rushed and must flee the pocket. A highly tight Michigan State defense closes in and spills O'Brien for no gain. Now 4th down with 3 yards to go as the third quarter ends. On the first play of the final period, the Irish elect to go for the field goal. Joe Mazzaro's 28-yard attempt is good, and that ties the score at 10. It's a battle of defenses in the 4th quarter. Jimmy Ray tried to pass his Michigan State team to victory near the end of the game, but Tom Chain intercepts for Notre Dame. It's Chain's 2nd interception of the game, and he returns this one 31 yards to the Spartan 18. Golden opportunity for the Irish as their fans go wild. Coley O'Brien falls on Dave Haley, but the junior halfback was caught in a Spartan blitz for an 8-yard loss. Unable to move the ball in 3 downs, Joe Mazzaro tries to win the game with a 41-yard field goal. It's long enough, but wide to the right. The collegiate football game of the decade ends in a 10-10 tie. It's a tremendous letdown for everyone as the long-awaited class of Giants fails to produce a winner.
Please help me in welcoming John Heisler.
Andy, thank you very much. Just to give you a little sense of where that came from, back in those days, and really for up until the 80s, we used to produce actually hired a company from Philadelphia called Telrow Productions. They would literally go to every single football game, shoot every play of every game, 16 millimeter film. At the end of the year, we would put together a game-by-game highlight film that essentially was used by all of our coaches in recruiting. I think we gave one to the Alumni Association to use for their purposes, and so that little segment that you saw was actually taken from the 66 version of that. That was a guy named Bob Wolf, if you're familiar with sports announcers from that era. Bob Wolf was the one who was doing the voiceover on that. I'm just curious, how many of you were in school here at Notre Dame when this game was played? Oh, pretty good bunch. How many of you, any of you actually at the game? Wow, pretty good number. Anybody here from Michigan State? Nobody? No, a couple, sort of. They're not grudgingly admitting that. So, anyway, that's good. That gives us a pretty good sense of where we are here. So Clark's going to take this way more seriously than I am. I'm guessing that a lot of you have probably heard plenty about this, seen the game, seen highlights. Even this week, as you can guess, it got a lot of attention. There was a story just yesterday on ESPN.com that Mark Schlabach did about the game. There was one earlier in the week in the Chicago Tribune. The Detroit Free Press had a pretty good piece on Sunday. I'm guessing there may well be another round of it in November when you get to the actual anniversary of the date. But it probably wasn't by accident that the 66 National Championship team picked this particular weekend to come back into town. So despite the attention that this game seems to get, as you can guess, this is kind of a celebration of a national championship and not just a single football game as far as all these 66 guys are concerned. They're going to have a dinner tonight over in the Monogram Room. Era's going to be there, which should be great. So Mike Collins, who I think was in school at the time and still does our PA here at the stadium, and a guy by the name of George Blaha, who's a Notre Dame graduate. He's actually been doing radio play-by-play at Michigan State for, I believe, 39 years, a long time. Those two are going to do kind of a Q&A with Era tonight. I'll be there. I'm going to write a story about it, so look for that tomorrow on our website. I'm not sure if they're going to shoot video, but that may well be an option as well. Anyway, I'm going to have some fun with this. Full disclosure, if you're really interested in this game, this is probably the best thing ever produced. I think it's out of print. It was written in 1992, but it's an entire book just about this football game and kind of all the things that led up to it. Got a lot of cultural stuff in it, and I borrowed liberally from that piece. I actually just stopped in the bookstore. Didn't see it over there, so you may have to go to Amazon to find it. But again, if you're a real serious historian or you're really interested in that game, that would be probably the definitive piece. Anyway, so we're going to sort of take it back to 1966 here to start. Just to give you a sense of some of the other stuff that was going on, not too long before this game, Muhammad Ali fought a heavyweight bout in the Astrodome in Houston, and there were big complaints because the tickets cost $10. People thought that was just ridiculously expensive. That same year, 1966, in the United Kingdom, Prince Charles turned aged 18. Anybody that's a current college student would have no idea about this one, but the big news in television was that CBS announced that it was bringing the Smothers Brothers back as a variety show. That was big stuff. And the hit songs back in 1966, The Poor Side of Town by Johnny Rivers, You Keep Me Hanging On by the Supremes, and Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys was number one at one point in 66. A couple other things. The biggest controversy going on college campuses everywhere was birth control. How about that? And at Notre Dame, an even bigger controversy was the security group at the university was looking into allegations that there were architecture students who were mass producing fake IDs. And there was a suggestion that about 3/4 of the Notre Dame student body was drinking illegally using these IDs. I have to say the report that I found about that suggested that it really wasn't that big a deal. Interestingly, 1966, it was the last year that Notre Dame students were required to wear coat and ties to the dining hall. And also, it was just 1 year after the first female professor was granted tenure at Notre Dame. That happened in 1965. If you're a baseball fan, Sandy Koufax was pitching for the Dodgers. He won 27 games that year and retired the week of the Notre Dame-Michigan State game. There was probably no, we got a couple of notes about this guy, there was no more well-known celebrity anywhere in college football, much less in Lansing, than a guy named Bubba Smith, partly because of his size, partly because of how good he was. but without question, everybody in Lansing knew who this guy was, whether you were interested in football or not. That's just how big a name he was. Anyway, he had a roommate by the name of John Gorman. So the week of the game, John Gorman was from Chicago. Gorman borrowed $100 from Bubba, went downtown, had buttons, had a couple thousand buttons made up that said, "Kill Bubba, kill." They sold them all. The two of them made all kinds of money, and that maybe was as big a profit as anybody made in the whole week in terms of killing on their investment. So there were all kinds of, probably not as much at Notre Dame, but as you get Michigan State being the home team, there were a million reasons why people thought that they could figure out how to get a ticket. So maybe the most creative one was a letter that the ticket manager at Michigan State got from someone who said, "I know that if President Johnson wanted to come to the game, that you would find a way to get him a ticket. He's not coming, so how about if you sell me the ticket?" So the ticket manager was impressed with that, and he did. He sold the guy the ticket. The price of tickets for this game, the base price was $5. That's pretty amazing. Maybe the biggest controversy that came out of this was the television arrangements, or the lack thereof at the time. So back in those days, you could be on television. Again, ABC had the exclusive contract. You generally weren't on unless you were on ABC. We had a little bit of a grandfather clause for a long time that allowed games to be shown here in South Bend. But in this case, Notre Dame had been on national television against Purdue early in the season. So this technically was not allowed to be any more than a regional telecast. Well, that, as you can guess, created a huge uproar. This was also going to be the first time that there was ever a college football doubleheader on television, because they were going to televise USC and UCLA as the second game. So anyway, ABC received 50,000 pieces of mail, and they basically said that all of them in objection to what their policy was. They said that was 49,999 pieces more than they'd ever received about anything remotely connected with sports. Those sorts of things just didn't cause controversies. They received another petition in the mail that had 20,000 signatures asking them to find a way to make this more available. So at one point they were going to allow the alumni clubs to close circuit this to the campuses and to the alumni clubs. Then they finally figured out a way at the 11th hour to essentially make it a regional telecast, but there were only a couple of states, I think Alaska and Hawaii, that actually didn't see the game live, and then they were going to tape delay it to everybody else. So they found a way to deal with it. Anyway, the guy who was in charge of public relations at ABC Sports at the time was a guy named Bino Cook, who went on to become the SID at the University of Pittsburgh. Actually, maybe that was before that, I think, actually. But in more recent years, he passed away a few years back, but he went to work for ESPN. The guy is hilarious. He's an old school guy. You may have heard him on the radio or seen him on television. But anyway, you can imagine his effectiveness from a public relations standpoint in kind of these old media days. So his best line, this is number 13 up here, his best line was that we're putting out enough material on this one football game to make Gone with the Wind look like a short story. So at the beginning of the season, again, Notre Dame was coming off, I think, 7-2 in one season in '65, but certainly there was great optimism about the season. But the way it worked back then was students had the ability to request tickets for away games before the season ever started. Well, the end result was that only 500 tickets had been requested by students, which didn't turn out to be anywhere near as enough to satisfy the demand. So they actually held a lottery. That was probably the beginning of what became much more commonplace as far as tickets were concerned. And as you can guess, there was great interest in who was going to get those tickets. There were all kinds of other goofy things that happened in terms of just fun and games between the two schools. The last item on this slide talks about a group of Michigan State fans that hired a plane and dropped thousands of leaflets on the Notre Dame campus. And again, understand that this was a time when there was all kinds of politics, heavy-duty political things going on in the world. The Pentagon was involved in all kinds of stuff, so these were leaflets, and they were addressed to the peace-loving villagers of Notre Dame. And here's what they said. They said, "Our friends, why do you struggle against us? Why do you persist in the mistaken belief that you can win freely and openly against us? Your leaders have lied to you. They have led you to believe that you are more powerful than we. They have led you to believe you can win. They have given you false hope. They have deceived their own people. We have nothing but affection for Notre Dame." And the leaflet was signed, "A free message from Michigan State University of America." So anyway, part of the reason that this game and the circumstances of it when you got down to football got a lot of attention was that Nick Eddy, who was our All-America running back that year, had already had a whole bunch of injury problems. Then he fell getting off of the train as our team traveled to East Lansing. Now, this was at a time when our team had taken flights before, so this wasn't the only way to get there. But ironically, and I'm not going to tell you it was just because of Nick Eddy, this turned out to be the last time that a Notre Dame football team ever traveled to a game by train. How about that? Interestingly enough, nowadays, if you follow big-time football, teams on Friday night get hidden away in hotel rooms, and heaven forbid that they're allowed to breathe any fresh air. Coaches are showing video and otherwise trying to keep them as far away from civilization as possible. Well, that wasn't the case at all on this particular Friday night. Back in those days, there was no freshman eligibility. You only could play varsity athletics for 3 years. So freshman football was a pretty big thing. We only played 3 or 4 games a year, but generally we played Michigan State. We played Tennessee, I think. We played Michigan some years, but freshman games were a big thing because for everybody it was kind of a look at the next wave of players. So the game was played Friday night in Lansing. It was played at a high school stadium that sat about 4,000 people. There were about 6,000 people who showed up and somehow crammed their way in. Notre Dame won the game 30-27 on a field goal at the very end. Both head coaches sat in the press box, Duffy Doherty from Michigan State and Era, and both of the whole entire teams came and watched the football game. So about that, that's what they did on an average Friday night. Another interesting Friday night saga. So the athletic director at Michigan State was a guy named Biggie Munn. He'd been at Michigan State for a long time. Was a very familiar, colorful figure. He and Moose Krause, you can imagine, were great friends and made a great pairing. So Biggie's phone rings late on Friday night, and it's the East Lansing Police Department, and they have, not sure if he was actually arrested, but they've stopped Bubba Smith. So Bubba and several of his teammates were driving around. Bubba drove a big white Riviera that in those days was hard to miss. Apparently Bubba had rolled up a whole bunch of parking and traffic tickets that he'd chosen to ignore. And so this particular Friday night, this policeman from East Lansing decided that this was the time to do something about that. And so Bubba and his teammates did not have any money with them at the time. The police wanted $45 to bail him out. So Biggie Munn came to the police station, walked up to the cop on duty, and his first comment was, "How could you?" And an hour later, somehow Bubba was free. In this day and age, Michigan State, I would tell you, has a pretty good-sized press box even back then, but there were 754 media people who were credentialed for this football game. That was an ungodly number at the time. And even the Super Bowl, for some number of years after '66, did not have that many people covering it. So that gives you kind of a sense of just where this game stood. In terms of the game itself, you saw the highlights, and you probably know all you need to know about the game itself. Interestingly enough, there were no personal fouls in the game. There were no pass interference calls. There were no holding calls. Notre Dame's penalties included all of 5 yards, so it was a very well played game from that aspect of it. One of them I skipped back on the other one. Interestingly enough, if you recognize the name Jerry Markbright, he was a very visible and long-time NFL official. He was the back judge in this particular game. He was 31 years old. It was his very first year officiating Big Ten football games. So you can guess what magnitude this all meant for him. 22 on there. This shows you how times were different. Back in those days, 1966, Eric Arsegian's phone number was in his home phone number. It was in the phone book. And as you can guess, with a game of this magnitude, he ended up getting a few phone calls. In fact, he apparently went to a, whoops, did I do that? We'll go back on here. He apparently was convinced after the game, late that Saturday night, to go to some sort of a social function at some friends of theirs that lived not too far away. Somehow their babysitter told a caller where Era was and gave him the number to call, and so Era stuck in the middle of the night talking to somebody that he didn't really want to talk to. So the reality of this was that it was not too long after that that the Era Arsegian number in the phone book became unlisted. So a week later, Notre Dame obviously had an advantage of having one more game to play out at USC. Father Hesberg, who was president at the time, couldn't go to the game because he was in Paris at an educational conference. So he called the local AP office in Paris and in his best French asked for the score of the game and got it back in French and found out it was 51-0, and a couple of days later Notre Dame ended up #1 in both polls and won the national championship. To give you a sense of the postseason back then, there were only 9 bowl games, and obviously Notre Dame was not going to bowl games at the time, wouldn't start that for another 3 years. Back in those days, the conference champion was the only one in a league that was allowed to go, and as far as the Rose Bowl in particular was concerned, you were not allowed to go in successive years. So UCLA also was ranked 5th. They were 9-1, but they played Michigan State in the Rose Bowl the previous year, so none of those 3 teams, essentially 3 of the top 5 teams that year, Notre Dame, Michigan State, and UCLA, none of the 3 of them played in a bowl game. But just to give you a sense of the rivalry, as much as we all take it seriously, and certainly this was something probably close to a life and death situation as far as the game itself. With neither Michigan State or Notre Dame playing in a bowl game that year, there was an all-star game. The North-South game was one of the more prominent all-star games. So there were 4 players from Notre Dame that were at that game: George Gedeke, Larry Conjar, John Horney, and Pete Duranko. Bubba Smith played for Michigan State, Charlie Thornhill, one of their more visible players, and a couple others. The game was played on Christmas Day, and as the story goes, all these guys had become good enough friends and all had respect enough for each other that the 8 of them sat around in a hotel room the night before the game, drinking beer and singing Christmas carols. So that was maybe a fitting way to end that. So anyway, this part was all kind of fun. I'm going to turn it over to Clark, and he's going to give you a little bit more serious take on this.
Thanks, John. I hope I have a little comic relief. As you heard, I've been given the task of reflecting on this. I'm not an historian, by the way. I'm going to come at this in terms of my own discipline, not so much psychology, but the sort of teaching ethics. And my claim here, let me see if I can get this to go in the right direction. I want to focus on this title, From Controversy to Understanding and Development. So my claim is that controversy is a good thing when you're teaching ethics, because it allows us to clarify what divides us, disagreements that we have. And I think if it goes well, we get into each other's shoes and try to see things from each other's point of view. And as John points out, the game that we're reflecting on, the 1966 game, was listed not only as the greatest football game ever played, and there are some people who will still say that, but also one of the most controversial. And when Mandy asked me to talk, I was like, oh, I better reflect on what made it controversial and what were the values behind all that and what moral lessons can be learned from that. I think one thing, as you'll see, is that the game comes out of a decade in which there was a lot of change, and John highlighted a lot of that. This was the decade of Kennedy, his assassination. It was the decade of the spacewalk. We shouldn't forget that. Martin Luther King's protests, things were going on in China. We did have the Beach Boys, but we also had the Beatles. And then, since we're at Catholic University, don't forget Vatican II. which ended in December 1965, and Catholics started eating meat in 1966. So back, I think it was, we look back at this game, we'll discover that many of the social, political, and cultural changes and controversies of the decade were actually swirling around the Spartan Stadium on November 19th. And we're also going to discover, I hope in this little presentation I give, that in kind of an eerie way, those changes and controversies are still very much with us today. And I'll try to show you that, or at least I'm going to claim that. So, this is my teacher now, also in the 60s and in 66. This is Lawrence Kohlberg. He actually laid out an empirical basis for encouraging people doing what I do, trying to bring about moral development through discussion. He proved that the controversy is an essential way to do this, that people only change their minds and develop their points of view when there is some controversy and difference of opinion. So thanks to Larry, who was my doctoral teacher. And this is where I ended up, and where's Kristen Sheehan, who works with me, Play Like a Champion Today program. I got started in Notre Dame, and we just in the last month spun out as our own nonprofit organization. And we encourage coaches and their parents to discuss not only sports but current events with their children in an effort to turn sport into an opportunity for moral development and civic development, as well as athletic development. So here's the tie. And Sean has said an awful lot. I learned a lot. Very grateful for for all John had to say. We haven't had a tie for 20 years because we did away with that possibility. And we now have a college playoff tournament, so we don't rely totally on pollsters. I read in the paper, you may have seen this, that Michigan State defensive back Demetrius Cox will be playing tomorrow night. Said that the last time he played for a tie in competition was at a tic-tac-toe game with one of his friends. So what's the controversy? Rocky Bleier said that during the Michigan State game, the players were the Michigan State players in that famous 1 minute and 10 seconds where Notre Dame had the ball and a chance to win the game. Bubba Smith, who figures prominently into every story, was saying, "Come on, sissies, throw the ball. I'll call timeout for you." And then Charlie Thorndale, one of their linebackers, said, "You guys don't want it." And had a number of the critics said just the same thing. So this was the Sports Illustrated cover. It's a little hard to read it. You may remember it. How many people remember this cover? Do you know what the Notre Dame students did with it? You may have been part of it. They burned this Sports Illustrated magazine in front of Rockney Gymnasium when it appeared. Not to be encouraged. As a moral educator, I would say students should have read it and disagree with it. And the cover read, "Notre Dame runs out the clock against Michigan State." Our Parsegian recently said, "We didn't go for a tie, the game ended in a tie. We didn't run the clock out, the clock ran itself out." Right, and what Aris said, and you probably would maybe remember reading this, we fought hard and we came back to tie it up, as you saw in the clip, and after that I didn't want to risk giving it to them cheap. They got reckless and it could have cost them could have cost really us the game. I wasn't going to do a jackass thing like that at this point. To put it in moral terms, I would say, maybe you'd agree, I would put prudence ahead of what you might call the virtue of courage. Our would have said it wasn't a virtue at all. It would have been foolhardiness, which my ethics students know is not a virtue to be foolhardy. And as another commentator said about this, Aaron knew his base. He knew that the sports writers would keep Notre Dame, put Notre Dame in #1 as long as they would knock off USC, as John pointed out. They did. Now, Bubba Smith knew that too. And this is interesting in terms of what we're about to hear. He said to his teammates, again, reportedly, The clock is running out. Do you think those sports writers are going to let a team with predominantly black players, the majority of the players on Michigan State were black, do you think they're going to let that team win a championship? We're going to have to find a way to win it on the field. So that was his perspective, and then we'll see what people think later. One other thing that I found interesting is that you recognize the man in the middle? Yeah. Do you recognize the man to his left? Yeah. I like Ike. And the man to his right. Anybody know that person? No, I'm sorry. The one to the left. I'm sorry. Depends on your perspective. The one to the left of Father Heisler. That's John Hanna. Now, the reason why they're in this picture is that he was the chair of the Civil Rights Commission that Eisenhower formed, and Father Hesburgh served on that commission. And John Hanna and Father Hesburgh were close friends, and that friendship went well beyond. They used to watch the football games together when they could. So that's an interesting piece of history. I think the fact that we're going to talk some about the civil rights struggles that went on. So let's look at this. Oh, I just had it flash forward. Do you remember this, by the way? Yeah. Why did Hope Solo call the Swedes a bunch of cowards? Yeah. They were playing defensively, and Hope Solo had a colorful way to put it. She said, we showed a lot of heart, but we played a bunch of cowards. The best team didn't win today. I strongly believe that. The coach of the other team I had once coached, Hope Solo herself said, I don't give a crap. I'm going to Rio and she's staying home. So there you go. But I think this controversy over do you play defensively or do you play offensively, this keeps popping up. How about this? Now, those of you who remember the game, do you remember Alabama? Yeah. So there was this is kind of interesting because Bama went undefeated, and they did play the bowl game. They beat Nebraska. So they thought, what do you think today? Would pollsters have given it to Bama? Do you think they went undefeated? Michigan State and Notre Dame had top. We may want to look at records. My own view, Notre Dame played a much tougher schedule. I'm not biased. I went to Villanova, but this is what the Bama people said. Okay, and here's the case that could be made. So this guy, Keith Donovan, writes a book, and he says that this is the greatest injustice. I'd like to read a little bit, but what I think we need to know is that in the year 1966, and you may remember this, Lurleen Wallace ran in his place. And 2 weeks before the Michigan State game, they win they're elected governor, I say. Actually, Lurleen ended up passing away, I think, a month after the election. So Donovan writes a book, says this is the greatest injustice in college football history. So talk about controversy. Maybe that's controversy. Here's what. Vince Lombardi seemed to think Alabama was pretty good, by the way. When he won the first Super Bowl, he said, they asked him, are you the best team in the United States? He said, I don't know, we haven't played Alabama yet. That was his kind of a line. Here's what Donovan said. Donovan said that basically the sports writers were so angry at segregation in the South, particularly in the state of Alabama, there's no way they were going to put Alabama number one. He was a little bit more colorful. He's describing Ara's decision. He called it rebellious and utterly anti-establishment. He compared Ara to bra burners and war protesters and acid heads. And then in a famous line, he said, it was like seeing John Wayne parade around the room in high heels and a strapless gown. Okay? So from the Alabama perspective, this was pretty controversial. So let's take a look at some of other controversy, and then we could talk. Another thing to recall, if we're thinking about integration, was this basketball game, which was played in '66, right? Disney made a movie of it. Western Texas started an all-African-American team, 72. Kentucky all-white team, 65. That was a big breakthrough in sports, as was the game that Notre Dame and Michigan State played. In terms of, if you want to look at the '66, you may recall the march, and James Meredith being shot, and then we have beginnings really of the Black Power movement, and we have the beginning of Stokely Carmichael, and a frustration with Martin Luther King at that point, and the discussion around, well, maybe we have to take our guns and defend ourselves because people can shoot innocent black people otherwise. Some other issues. So today, we're still having our protests. We also have, this was a game that was broadcast in Vietnam, and that there's also echoes of this that surface in the game. For example, OBrien had said after the game, well, I hope our troops in Vietnam don't play for a tie. So this is an interesting, so Vietnam was in it, and as you will recall, this is a cover, actually this wouldn't have been, this cover from '66 about whether to go in and enlist or whatever, this is in the draft. We have the beginnings of the anti-war movement, and troops in Vietnam went up to almost 500,000 people. So the beginnings of the war protest and the controversy there. So we have the Hawks, and then we have these kind of stereotypes, Hawks versus Doves, and a lot of criticism from the Hawks that the Doves were playing not to win in Vietnam, that they didn't unleash all the power that the American military had. Thought I would bring up, don't have time to discuss it, Colin Kaepernick, but very interesting discussion today, very much like the discussion that many of you would remember in the '60s. So do people who protest, are they really loyal, or are they showing disrespect for the flag and for the national anthem and whatever? Where are we in 2016? Well, you know, lots and lots of controversy. What do I think about ties? Let me tell you. I think that, to some extent, the Michigan State game is a tie that we can celebrate. And I also want us just to think that one tie that binds us, really are the ties that come from watching football games together and football teams coming back and having a beer together, as John said. And also the kind of consensus that emerges when we do have honest moral discussion. And I thought you might find it interesting, maybe some of you have read this, that some of the principles in the '66 game actually have changed their mind. The writer of the Sports Illustrated article said, well, he was caught up in all the controversy and he wished Notre Dame had tried to throw a few passes at the end of the game. But Bubba Smith, who features prominently in any story about that game, the last thing he said about the game was in 2011, which was the year he died. If we want to talk about controversy, when he died he had stage 3 CTE. So there's something we're talking about today. He said he changed his mind about Ara's decision. He said, at the time it was happening and I was yelling, you're playing for a tie, but I have apologized to Parsegian for the anguish that game caused him. I later realized it was a brilliant move because Notre Dame had one more game to showcase their team, and we didn't, because back then we didn't go to the Rose Bowl in consecutive years. Looking back at the game and listening to John and watching the video, I've come to the conclusion, which maybe you have, that both teams gave that game their best, and that while it may be regrettable that either team won, do you think it would have been a worse tragedy if one of them lost? So thanks a lot, and we'll take questions.
We're going to go ahead and open it up to Q&A. We have about about 10 minutes or so for that. We are taping this, like I mentioned, so please wait for the mic, and we'll pass it to you and ask your question into the microphone so we make sure we get it for the video. John and Clark, you want to come up?
Sure.
Yeah, I have a comment. My roommate actually wished for the tie for that game because he knew Alabama was in the same caliber as Notre Dame or Michigan State, and if one of them would have lost, Alabama would have moved into second. And so he called it even before the game. And I don't know, his plan, I still wish we had ties instead of the other thing. What other things are we play for ties in human psychology?
Well, I was thinking, what do you do in a discussion? Sometimes in an argument, I think if you argue to win, nothing gets accomplished. A real good feature of an argument is that there'd be a meeting of minds at the end, which you could call kind of time. But I think people who are combative and defensive, that always ends up a disaster. And the work that we do with kids, when we talk about things, we said, let's see if we can come to mutual understanding. Once I can get into your shoes, and it's very hard as a Notre Dame fan for me to get into anybody else's shoes but our own. And psychologists study bias, so we all know that. And the great thing about discussion is you can actually get into somebody else's shoes. So that would be my pitch. I try to remember. I'd be trying to think of a sport that is.
Neither one of you addressed the Coley O'Brien situation with Handwriting being injured and Coley being diagnosed, I think, a week before as a diabetic, that he didn't have the strength to pass.
Yeah, I think that was definitely true. Handwriting got clobbered, as you saw in the video. I think Coley was getting some injections on the sidelines. I mean, this was a fairly new enough thing, and so I think kudos to him for hanging in there and getting them back to where they ended up at 10-10, and then obviously he played great the next weekend out in Los Angeles that really kind of turned the tide. So Coley was a guy who I think at one point that the quarterback race back in the spring had been fairly even, and there was some suggestion that maybe it wasn't going to be Terry Handwriting, as good as Terry was, that Coley O'Brien might well have won the job. So he certainly was maybe he was a backup, but he was pretty darn good.
Nephew was too.
There you go.
It was mentioned about African American players for Michigan State. Was Alan Page the only one at Notre Dame playing at that time?
Yes.
And the other question is, in 1967, were there any other freshmen that were African American that played, or did it take a while to?
I don't know. I can't remember.
He was the only one, right?
At the time, you have to go back and look at the game program, and
That's right.
he was the only one pictured that was black.
Regarding Joe's comment on Coley O'Brien, Brian Bullock told me that at the end of the game, Coley also told him he was having trouble with his vision, which is another aspect of diabetes. And regarding the tie, it used to annoy the heck out of me when I would see chess world championship matches where they purposely played to tie matches, and they would play 25 matches and the winner would win 3. So I guess there is at least one competitive endeavor where a tie is considered a good thing.
It appeared that the quarterback from Michigan State was African American, Jimmy Ray. There could not have been many African American quarterbacks in 1966. Do you know if there were any other than in a black school, any other Division I African American quarterback? So no African American started an NFL game at quarterback until I think 1968 in Denver.
I mean, I think Michigan State, if they weren't the most progressive team in the country in that era, they were certainly very close. And I think Tyrone Willingham, when he was our coach, used to talk about that extensively, because that was a big reason why he went to Michigan State, was that there were opportunities there that simply didn't exist. I think there were some lines in that book from several of the African American players at Michigan State that basically said they went to Michigan State because there were just a ton of other places where they couldn't go. They weren't welcome to come as a football player. So again, whether it was John Hanna, I don't know how long he'd been at Michigan State or who started that or who made those decisions in East Lansing, but but it kind of changed the face of football in the Big Ten and in general, probably.
I mean, I do think that basketball did play a huge role, and Bear Bryant said after that season, after 66 season, we better get ourselves some African American basketball or football players, and so part of that was driven, I don't think, by any sort of moral concern for fairness. I think we wanted to win football games, and after watching Bubba Smith play, so things changed, and actually the SEC desegregated the following year. I think Kentucky was the first team there.
We didn't know anyone at Notre Dame at the time of the game. I remember watching it with my brother. But what happened in the locker room after the game? What was the mood of the players and how did they feel about it?
I think everybody was frustrated as much as anything. I don't think anybody was celebrating in any way, shape, or form. I think there's a line in the book that talks about Father Hesburgh and John Hannah literally going together to both locker rooms, and there was some sense that you were congratulating them on how the game had been played, and another sense that you were kind of consoling them on sort of the disappointment that they hadn't won, or that something positive hadn't come out of it for anybody, at least at that point. So it was kind of hard. Actually, I'm sure it'll be online. I forget when it's going to go up there, but I did it's in the game program for tomorrow. I did a long interview with Jim Lynch, and he talks about how even going into the next week that he wasn't convinced that they were in very good shape at USC because everybody was just exhausted, both physically and mentally. Then they got to travel across country to get to Los Angeles, play a pretty decent USC team, and he felt like going in that Notre Dame didn't have much going for it at all. So he was flat shocked at the outcome. The score maybe even more so than just the fact that Notre Dame won, because he just felt like they put so much into the Michigan State game in all aspects that that it was some number of days before people really recovered from that.
I did have a line from Rocky Blyer, how he was quoted, that Ara said, I'll just quote what Rocky Blyer said, Ara said, "Time will prove everything that has happened today, and you'll see that after the rabble-rousers have had their say, cooler minds who understand the true odds will know that Notre Dame is a team of champions." So that was what he remembered that locker room.
I just want to comment about Notre Dame's injuries. We lose an All-American running back. We lose our All-American quarterback. And before the game was over, if I recall, we lost our starting center, Gedeke. And I don't think Michigan State was quite that handicapped, but we were physically.
Any more questions?
I was just going to make a comment as being at the game, coming out of there. It was just kind of like you're just leaving like a funeral. Nobody was talking. It was just, even in the crowd, like the people would walk by each other, no matter what team. And it was just, and then the most exciting moment that I had on the campus of Notre Dame is when the team came back on Monday night and they had the pep rally at the old basketball arena. And I think when we went in there, it was like, I think outside it was like about 20 degrees. We got in there, I think it was like about 95 by the time you're just sweating. And you went home just in a sweat, t-shirt. So.
There were some descriptions in the book and some other places I've seen that suggested that once the game ended in the stadium, it just kind of went silent. Nobody quite knew what to do. Everybody was kind of stunned. They didn't know how to react. And people just sort of stood there for some length of time and finally just kind of walked out. And it just wasn't what anybody expected.
There wasn't any loud noises at all.
Right.
I think we've got 2 more questions here.
My father was with me at the game, and he had been an old football coach. And he pointed to me and saw O'Brien on the bench crying at the end of that game. And my father turned to me and said, "Marty, that's the difference between college football and pro football."
question?
Since you showed it on the screen, I'd like to ask you, what dynamics in the classroom would you use with the Colin Kaepernick situation? If you might take home and look at an example.
Thank you. Yeah, funny you should ask. There's a student here who we actually talked about it the other day. What I just said when we think about Kaepernick, we were talking about virtues and sort of what would go into our bag of virtues today. Starting with Aristotle and with Ben Franklin and whatever. Somebody talked about loyalty, and I said, what about Kaepernick? So we did have an interesting discussion about what loyalty means, and then people were chipping in, well, Kaepernick said he didn't mean to offend the military, respect the military, and a bunch of people are following Kaepernick, and President Obama said, may not agree with the guy, but we want to protect his right to say what he said, and also his right to sort of engage an issue that's somewhat controversial in America about how African Americans are treated by the police, etc. I think the class really embraced it, and we got a lot clearer on what we meant by loyalty. That loyalty doesn't mean blind obedience or following the leader or whatever, but there's an element of questioning, and if you're really loyal, you want your country or your football team or whatever to be as best as it can be. That was it.
All right, well, on behalf of the Alumni Association and our audience, we want to thank you, and John and Clark. Thank you. Family wines for our presenters. I just wanted to mention that there is a mobile survey available. Sorry, it's not showing up on the screen, but please check on your mobile phone for a survey if you'd like to take that. And then also, if you're interested in the Catching Up with Mike McCoy, the former All-American Notre Dame defensive lineman, the live conversation will take place on the stage between our building and the bookstore next door right now at 3 p.m. And that will be followed by an interview with Nick Eddy and Jim Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, and please watch for today's presentation on Notre Dame